The ring was 3 carats, cushion cut, set in platinum so cold and so bright it caught the light from across a crowded ballroom and made women sigh without knowing why. Dominic Hargrove had slipped it onto Celeste Vane's finger on a Tuesday evening in February, in front of 200 people who all clapped at exactly the right moment, because people who live at that altitude always know when to clap. She had cried, of course. One perfect tear down one perfect cheek. The photographer caught it. By morning it was on 3 websites. By afternoon it was a trending topic. By Thursday, a lifestyle magazine had already started drafting their cover story, the power couple of the decade. Neither of them had given the magazine permission. Neither of them needed to. When you exist at a certain level of beautiful and wealthy and young, the world simply writes stories about you without asking. Dominic had built his first company at 22, sold it at 25, built another, larger one on top of the ashes of the first. By 29, he had an empire in commercial real estate and a reputation for seeing things other men missed. Empty lots where others saw nothing, crumbling buildings where he saw gold. He was not cruel, but he was precise. He did not waste words or warmth on people who could not keep up. He dressed in charcoal and navy. He ran at 5 in the morning. He had never, not once in his adult life, felt afraid of anything. Celeste was something else entirely. She had grown up comfortable and had refined comfort into an art form. She moved through high society the way water moves through a riverbed. Naturally, inevitably, as though the whole world had been shaped just to accommodate her direction. She sat on charity boards and wore her hair in ways that made other women instantly want to cut theirs. She laughed at the right volume. She remembered the names of important people's children. She was not unkind, exactly. She was simply built for a world where kindness was decorative, something you displayed like fresh flowers on a foyer table. Together, they were the kind of couple that made people feel slightly worse about their own lives. Younger professionals printed their photos and pinned them to vision boards. Gossip columnists saved their names in speed dial. When their engagement was officially announced, a joint press release with a statement from Dominic's publicist and a photograph of them laughing on a yacht. The response was electric. Congratulations poured in from 3 continents. A senator sent a bottle of champagne. A former president's wife sent a handwritten note. It was the kind of life that looks from the outside like it cannot possibly break. It broke on a Thursday in October. The car was a black SUV, and it was raining, and the other driver ran a red light at 47 miles per hour. Dominic's vehicle hit the intersection at the exact wrong second. That was all it was. A second. The gap between the life he had and the life that came after was one ordinary, unremarkable second on a wet road at 9:15 at night. There were flashing lights afterward, red and blue, strobing across the rain-slicked asphalt, turning the broken glass into a galaxy of tiny mirrors scattered across the street. There were voices shouting in that flat, controlled urgency that emergency workers use, the language of people trained to keep fear out of their hands. The front of the vehicle was compressed inward like a crumpled piece of paper. The airbag had deployed. Dominic was alive, which was not guaranteed, and conscious, which was not expected, and absolutely still, which told the paramedics more than any vital sign. He remembered fragments, the smell of something burning, a woman's voice asking him to squeeze her hand, cold through his shirt where it had been cut away, the ceiling of the ambulance, white and featureless, passing above him like a slow tide. The hospital room was beige, not the warm, intentional beige of a well-designed space, but the tired, institutional beige of a place that has seen too many people at their worst and stopped trying to comfort them with color. The machines beeped. The fluorescent light above the bed buzzed at a frequency that lived just below conscious hearing, irritating something deep in the brain without ever quite surfacing. The doctors used words like spinal contusion and neurological impact, and cautiously optimistic, which Dominic had learned in those first gray days meant, we do not know yet. They watched his hands. They tested his reflexes. They asked him to lift things and push against resistance, and tell them where he felt sensation and where he did not. He answered each question in the same flat, controlled voice he used in boardrooms, because the alternative was to let the fear in, and he did not yet know what to do with fear of this particular size. Celeste came on the second day. She stood in the doorway for a moment before entering. Just a moment, barely a breath's worth of hesitation, but Dominic was lying flat on his back staring at the ceiling, and he caught it in his peripheral vision. That pause, that recalibration. She came in smiling, her coat still on, her bag still over her shoulder, like a woman who had not yet decided whether she was staying. She kissed his forehead. She told him he looked well, which was a lie he appreciated at the time. She sat in the chair beside the bed and talked about things that didn't matter. A dinner she'd attended, a friend's new apartment, the unseasonable cold. And her eyes moved to her phone twice in 10 minutes, and she left after 40. She had a meeting, she said. Of course she did. He told himself it was shock. He told himself grief takes strange shapes. He told himself the woman he had chosen, the woman whose face had been on magazine covers alongside his, was not the kind of person who simply diminished in the presence of inconvenience. But the visits grew shorter. The silences between her sentences grew longer. She began arriving later in the day, when the afternoon light was already thinning, and leaving before evening. She stopped bringing things, the specific coffee he liked, the books she'd once claimed she was reading to him. She stopped touching his arm when she spoke. She smiled, but it lived only at the surface of her face, going no deeper than the skin, unable to reach her eyes, which remained cool and calculating and fixed on some horizon he could not see from a hospital bed. He came home to the mansion 6 weeks after the accident. The house had 12 rooms and a staff of 4, and it felt, on the afternoon they brought him through the front door in a wheelchair he was determined to abandon by Christmas, like a museum after closing hours. Still, preserved, impressive in the way of things that exist to be looked at rather than lived in. The staff moved carefully around him, adjusting their voices, shortening their eye contact, treating him with the fragile consideration people reserve for the very sick and the very old. His assistant brought daily reports and folders, and left them on the desk without being asked for comment. His driver rerouted the car so Dominic wouldn't have to pass the intersection where it had happened. Everyone was very thoughtful. Everyone was managing him, carefully like a situation. Everyone except Rosa. She had worked in the house for 11 years. She was 43, compact and quiet, with dark hair pulled back and hands that were always doing something. Straightening, wiping, adjusting, folding. She did not have a manner. She had a presence, which is a different thing. A manner is performed. A presence simply is. On his 3rd day home, she knocked on the study door where he'd been sitting in the wheelchair staring at reports he couldn't yet concentrate on. She came in without waiting for him to answer, not with rudeness, but with the assurance of someone who has maintained a household long enough to understand that men like Dominic Hargrove did not always know what they needed until it arrived. She set a plate down beside him, not his usual catered lunch, something she had made. Soup, thick and dark, with bread on the side. She adjusted the pillow behind his lower back without commenting on it. She opened the window 2 inches because the room had grown stale. "Is there anything else?" she asked. He looked up at her. He was going to say no. He almost said no out of pure reflex. Instead, he said, "It's good." The soup. "My mother's recipe," she said and left. It was such a small thing. The kind of small thing that does not register in a life organized around large things. But Dominic found himself thinking about it that evening. About the specific quality of being seen without being pitted. About the difference between care and management. About the fact that Rosa had not looked at the wheelchair when she came in. She had looked at him. The days fell into a rhythm. Celeste appeared less and less. She had excuses that were technically plausible. Meetings, obligations, a charity gala she was co-chairing, the board dinner she couldn't miss. And he accepted them the way you accept a story you already know isn't quite true, because calling it a lie requires a confrontation neither of you is ready for. She attended the gala without him, 3 weeks after he came home. He saw the photographs the next morning. She was laughing in one of them, leaning into a man he didn't recognize, her head tilted back, her throat bare and white under the chandelier light. It was a casual photograph. Maybe it meant nothing. He looked at it for a long time. Through the wall of the study, late one evening, he heard her on the phone. He wasn't trying to listen. He was in the hallway, moving slowly on the cane he'd graduated to, and her voice came through the door of the sitting room, and certain words arrived before he could turn away. Words like timeline and prognosis, and what the lawyers say about assets acquired before the marriage. And I've been patient, I really have. He stood in the hallway for what might have been 30 seconds or 3 minutes. Then he moved on. That same week, Rosa appeared in the kitchen at 11 at night when he couldn't sleep and sat across from him at the kitchen table without being asked. She didn't ask what was wrong. She made 2 cups of tea and set one in front of him, and that was the entirety of the invitation. He found himself talking, not about Celeste, not directly, but about the accident, about waking up and not being certain what his body would do anymore, about having built a life on the certainty of his own capability and finding that certainty gone in the space of a second. She listened the way some people know how to listen, which is to say completely, with her hands around her cup and her eyes steady, and no urgency in her face whatsoever, as though she had nowhere else to be, as though his words deserved exactly this much space and room. She told him about growing up with nothing, about her mother working 2 jobs and still having the soup recipe memorized, because some things you carry regardless of what the world takes from you, about the specific dignity of a woman who has been poor for most of her life and never once let it make her small. Dominic listened and felt something in his chest shift incrementally, like a door opening an inch in a room that has been sealed for a long time. He began, quietly, to pay attention. He had Marcos, his personal assistant, bring him the company financials. He reviewed them slowly over days with the patience of a man who has learned that rushing is a luxury of the healthy. He was not as far from the business as everyone assumed. He saw the irregularities in the 3rd week, a series of transactions approved in his name during the 2 weeks he'd been hospitalized, moving funds between holding companies in patterns that made no obvious operational sense. A signature that was technically his, a digital authorization from an account Celeste had access to in an emergency. Transfers to accounts he didn't recognize. He said nothing. He made 1 call to a private investigator he had used once before. He waited. The picture assembled itself like a photograph in a dark room, slowly and then all at once. Celeste had begun working on a contingency plan in the 1st week of his hospitalization. Small financial movements, conversations with a lawyer who handled high-asset divorces, an arrangement, not yet formalized, with someone from his investment board who had always wanted a larger piece of the company than Dominic was willing to give. She had been patient, as she'd told the person on the phone. She had been patient and strategic, and she had assumed, reasonably, that a man confined to a wheelchair and uncertain of his future would not be watching. He let 3 more weeks pass. He watched his strength return. He ran the physical therapy in the mornings with a focused intensity that had surprised his doctor, who had revised his recovery timeline twice. He sat in meetings again, via video then in person. He wore suits. He said nothing about what he knew. He gave nothing away. He watched people decide what he was worth now that he had been broken, and he catalogued what he saw. On the day the investigator delivered his final report, 22 pages documented, verified, Dominic read it once in the morning and once in the afternoon, and then walked downstairs on his own, without the cane, moving carefully but steadily, and found Rosa polishing the glass on the hallway cabinet. "Will you be available this evening?" he said. "Around 7?" She turned. "Of course." "I'm going to need a witness," he said, "to something important." She nodded as though this were a perfectly ordinary request, which in her presence everything became. He had asked Celeste to come at 7. She arrived at 7:15, the small, habitual lateness of someone who has stopped trying to impress, and found him standing in the grand hall, under the chandelier with its 10,000 crystals, in his best charcoal suit. She came in smiling that surface smile, the one that lived only on her face, and stopped when she saw his expression. He didn't raise his voice. He was not a man who raised his voice. He spoke in the tone he used in negotiations, which was calm and complete and left no room for interpretation. He told her what he knew. He named the accounts and the dates and the amounts. He named the lawyer and the board member and the figure they'd agreed upon. He held the report loosely at his side and didn't open it because he didn't need to. He had memorized it. She tried, for a moment, the angle of misunderstanding. She said his name in a particular way, with injury in it, as if the act of knowing was itself a betrayal. And then something in his face, the absolute stillness of it, the precision of his certainty, stopped her, and she understood that there was nothing to perform here, no camera, no audience to manage, no story that would hold. Rosa was standing in the doorway to the corridor. She had heard enough. She had heard everything. Celeste left the house that night. The engagement was formally announced as ended the following morning, in a statement from Dominic's publicist that said nothing more than was necessary, which was all it needed to say. There was a brief and furious media cycle. Then other news replaced it, as other news always does. A month later, Dominic called Rosa into the study. He asked her to sit, which he had never done before. He told her he was restructuring his personal office, that he needed someone in a new role, head of household management and personal affairs, a position that had not existed before that morning. He named a salary that made her go still in her chair. He told her she was the most trustworthy person in his life, which he understood was a statement about his life as much as about her, and that he intended to correct both things going forward. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Hargrove." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm doing it." He had spent his whole adult life building things out of empty space, finding value where no one else had thought to look. It had made him wealthy. It had made him respected. It had not, until now, made him particularly wise. Wisdom, he was learning, is what you have left when the scaffolding comes down. When the car hits the intersection at the wrong second and you wake up in a beige room unsure of your hands. When the people you paid to love you reveal the careful arithmetic underneath. When the woman who had no reason to stay chose to stay anyway, not because you were powerful, but because she had grown up in a house where dignity was not dependent on circumstance, and she had no interest in a world where it was. He thought about his mother, sometimes who had died when he was 12, and who had loved him loudly and impractically and without condition. He thought about how he had spent 2 decades building a life so armored and precise that nothing she embodied could get through. He thought about a plate of soup set on a desk in a room with stale air, and a window open 2 inches, and a woman who looked at him and not the wheelchair. Royalty, he had been taught by every school and magazine and boardroom he'd ever entered, was a function of wealth and bloodline and polish. It was the ring and the yacht and the press release. It was the gala photograph and the trending topic and the congratulations from people with titles. But royalty, he understood now, sitting in the study where he'd first tasted his housekeeper's mother's soup and felt, for the first time since the accident, like a person rather than a problem. Royalty was something else entirely. It was the decision to stay, the choice to see, the willingness to be kind when kindness cost you something real, when it required you to show up in a hospital room without an agenda, to sit in a kitchen at 11 at night and listen to a broken man talk, to stand quietly in a doorway and guard someone's dignity without ever once asking for recognition in return. Character is not what you build when everything goes right. Character is what remains when the lights come down and the glass breaks and the ring feels heavy and there is no one left with a reason to be good except the people who are simply, stubbornly, quietly good. Rosa had always been noble. She had simply been waiting for the world to notice. It finally did.